Good day to you. It's dusk in the city of Durango, which is in the mountains of Mexico. I've only just arrived, and I'm going to take a walk through probably some unpredictable sounds and stuff as I talk about the main subject, which is very much related to Mexico, and that is cultures interacting with other cultures, or contact between cultures. The book starts off with colonialization, which fits right in with Mexico. In colonialization, you have the major seafaring powers of the world, based in Europe. That's Portugal, England, and Holland, starting to flex their seafaring muscles, so to speak, and sailing all over the world, and where they land, starting to, quote, colonize the peoples where they landed. When you colonize people, you set up your own British school system, you set up your own French church system. You know what I'm saying? You set up the infrastructure in the country that you're colonizing. And in part, the logic that goes along with this is that the colonies are inferior to the motherland, to the mother country. So a South Africa, inferior to the UK. A French Guiana, inferior to France. That's how it worked. And we know that this happened in the U.S. with indigenous peoples, as it happened here in Mexico with indigenous peoples. Aztecs and Mayans are the two tribes, nations, however you want to refer to them, cultures, which were colonized by the Spanish. When the Spain came here, and later when Spain was part of the French Empire, France was also here in Mexico, you have the subjugation of the peoples, you have the smashing down. In fact, the Spanish conquistadors used to make cathedrals, kind of like the one you see behind me here, used to put cathedrals on top of Aztec pyramids. They would smash the pyramids and build their cathedrals on top to show, in the absolute ultimate symbolic way, how they were subjugating the formerly indigenous Mexican peoples. All right, the book goes into a couple other different areas of the world I'm not going to spend much time on. There's Hawaii and Australia. Hawaii being part of the U.S. is interesting because it's so far away from the mainland, and yet it is as American as any other state. But we do know that the Hawaiian peoples were also viewed with a kind of condescension as to their mental abilities and the degrees to which they had progressed, similar to the people in Australia known as Aborigines, also peoples who, through various methods of control and power exercised by the colonial powers, because they had the military might, they had the muscle, and in some cases the native peoples actually believed in the colonial powers being a kind of divine intervention in their country. That's certainly what the Aztecs believed about the conquistadors, the Spanish Navy, Army, military people who landed here and conquered Mexico, is the Spanish indigenous peoples, the indigenous peoples, they weren't Spanish, they actually welcomed with open arms the conquistadors because they thought it was an arrival of a god. There's some great stories about that right in Mexico City where the Aztec Empire was focused. Now, along with this chapter comes a concept that a lot of academics talk about, which I want to make sure that we talk about, and it's called cultural imperialism. I don't know if you know that word imperial, but it basically means when a country overtakes another country because they can. They do it with their military might. They do that with their financing. They do that with overwhelming numbers of people. They do that in a bunch of ways. But in the modern age, it also happens through media. And the chapter does a great job of actually talking about American media and pointing out how American media is our greatest export. More than anything else, we send media around the world. And what happens is the media act as an ambassador for our country. They represent our values and show what we look like as Americans and how we sound, etc. But at the same time, those values start getting introduced into a foreign country. And that's where imperialism comes into play. It's when French people, instead of eating their 3-course meal, as they normally do, start getting into fast food and start eating McDonald's and giving up the French tradition of a long meal that's drawn out over the space of a person's company and enjoying the various flavors. That's something that can go away with cultural imperialism. It's been a concern by countries that have been occupied by other countries, by countries that have also been flooded by media from other countries. It's a concern of those countries, in essence, where there's an unequal balance. Now, within cultural imperialism, one particular branch of that research is called corporate colonialism. And that's where big multinational corporations are going into other countries, and we have them coming into our country here. Like BP is a big oil company, but it's from Britain. We have companies going all over the world as well. And when those companies go into more developing areas of the world where there's not as much attention paid to those countries in terms of media that circulate around the world, when those corporations go into these countries, what they can end up doing is tilting the news in such a way that if there's a bad incident that happens, let's say that an American company like Chevron it's an oil company, goes into Nigeria where there's a lot of oil in Nigeria, and Chevron has an oil spill, then Chevron can help tilt the news so that it doesn't show that oil spill. So that's just one way in which companies like Disney and Disneyland, etc., they're not going to focus attention on if somebody fell off of an amusement park ride and hurt themselves. So that's where we get corporate colonialism. Now we go to development communication, which I mentioned as well. When cultures come into contact with each other, one of the results sometimes is developmental communication. And that's where the country that has a relationship with another country, or the culture that has a relationship with another country, helps use the media to develop the country that needs developing. So here in Mexico, for example, it's an unusual country because it does have a lot of wealth to it. It has a lot of rich people here in Mexico, and the average Mexican citizen can eat very well. Even if you're poor on the streets, you can survive. You can live on fresh fruits, and people will give you tortillas and give you little enchiladas and other things just because there's so much food and bountiful food in Mexico. But at the same time, there's tremendous poverty. You have regions of Mexico still without running water, and so people go to the bathroom, to put it bluntly, and it goes into the streams, rivers, etc. So in those situations, media are expected to help build up the country, to report what is the latest update on the project to bring sewer service to this particular area. This is what media do in a country when they're trying to help the country build itself up. Now, one of the terms used in this chapter is a term that's used very often in graduate school, by the way. It's called cultural hegemony. Cultural hegemony. Cultural hegemony is the fear that one country is dominating another country's culture, that they have hegemony, total domination of that other culture. And the US and Britain and France have often been picked out as countries that are seen to be guilty of that, if you want to think of it that way, dominating another culture. There's a huge movement in Puerto Rico not to become more aligned with the United States, or even to secede from the U.S. Right now it's a commonwealth, it's not a state. And one of the reasons is because Puerto Ricans feel that they're just completely dominated, some Puerto Ricans, by American culture, right down to the language. And so cultural hegemony is that kind of concern by people that there is a country that has undue influence over another country when cultures come into contact with each other. Speaking of that kind of idea, the U.S. has lots of icons or advertising brands, you may think of them as, listed in the book, which are all over the world. The most famous ones like Coca-Cola, McDonald's. I'm just looking for any of those right here on this street in downtown Durango. And I don't see any right now, but if I do, I'll certainly point them out. We've got McDonald's. This is a Canadian brand here, Wings Army. So the point during what I'm trying to say now is that these brands exist all over the world. You can find in an African village the McDonald's Golden Arches. That's what also happens when cultures come into contact with each other. Okay, And then I'm just going to finish now with adapting. Adapting is a concept because cultures do need to adapt. And one of the areas is to adapt the message. So still talking about the area, look at this typical Mexican. That's Mexican revolutionary behind me, depicted in a statue. I'll have to find out who that is later. He's got the 2 machine gun belts across him, speaking to at least some of the mythology behind the Spanish violence that was translated into the modern day Mexico culture. But you can see right now, very calm street, people walking down, young people, tourists here. I passed some French speakers a few minutes ago. So speaking of adapting when you're doing business in another country is you are making sure that the content that you're distributing in that country is appropriate to that culture. So, for example, Coca-Cola is a company that is all over the world, is craved by people who want a Coke. But when you get a Coke in an English pub, for example, versus a U.S. bar, it's almost a completely different experience. For a start, in an English pub, they conserve ice. So they only put 1 or 2 cubes of ice in your drink. In America, we're used to the opposite. So showing a commercial as simple as that, with a lot of ice in it in England is not going to work. It's not going to work. It's not going to resonate with the people. It's not going to resonate with the bars, etc. So that's about adapting to a message. And similarly, Heinz 57, a big product based in Pennsylvania, that 57 actually stands for 57 different ketchups that they make. They alter them based on what region of the world has a particular taste for a particular ingredient. For example, in Asian countries, they ramp up the soy sauce. In America, in the US and Mexico, they ramp up the white sugar. In England, it's more about the vinegar. So adapting to other cultures, adapting to your products is also part of what happens when 2 cultures clash together. And what you end up inevitably is a brand new culture, like this one. This is Mexico today. This is not Spain from the past. This is not indigenous peoples Mexico from many, many centuries ago. This is a new and emerging Mexico. I hope you have a great day.